The bright lights of CNN's Manhattan studio blazed with the intensity of 1,000 suns, casting sharp shadows across the pristine glass desk, where some of America's most influential voices gathered each weeknight to dissect the day's political drama. It was 8 p.m. Eastern on a humid Tuesday evening, and Sterling Tonight was in full swing, the network's flagship political analysis show that drew millions of viewers hungry for the latest commentary on Washington's endless theater. At the center of it all sat Victoria Sterling, CNN's golden child of political journalism. Her platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon that had probably cost more than most Americans made in a week. At 42, she was the epitome of Manhattan media elite, Vassar College alumna, Columbia journalism graduate, and the daughter of a prominent Park Avenue surgeon. Her crisp diction and razor-sharp delivery had made her a household name, though her critics often noted that her interviews felt less like journalism and more like performances designed to showcase her own intellectual superiority. Tonight's panel included the usual suspects: Dr. Marcus Rothschild, a political science professor from Georgetown, whose bow ties were as predictable as his liberal talking points; Amanda Chen, a young progressive activist whose Twitter following exceeded the population of several small states; and seated somewhat uncomfortably, at the far end of the curved desk, Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana. Kennedy, at 73, cut a distinctly different figure from his fellow panelists. Where they wore expensive designer suits that whispered of Manhattan boutiques and Washington power lunches, Kennedy's navy blue suit looked like it had come from a reliable department store in Baton Rouge. His silver hair was neatly combed, but lacked the salon-perfect styling of his companions, and his tortoiseshell glasses had the practical look of something chosen for function rather than fashion. Most notably, when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of Louisiana's bayou country, a slow, melodic drawl that seemed to turn every sentence into a story, and every observation into a piece of folk wisdom. 300 miles south, in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Lafayette, Louisiana, Marcus Williams sat transfixed before his television screen, his 19-year-old face a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Marcus had been watching CNN religiously since starting his political science studies at the University of Louisiana, partly because he dreamed of someday working in Washington, but mostly because seeing Senator Kennedy on national television gave him hope that someone who sounded like home could make it in the big leagues. Marcus had spent his entire young life battling shame about his own accent. In high school, guidance counselors had suggested he take speech classes to neutralize his regional dialect if he wanted to be taken seriously in college. His first semester at university had been a minefield of self-consciousness, watching professors and classmates react with barely concealed amusement whenever he spoke up in class. He'd started staying silent, swallowing his thoughts rather than endure the subtle condescension that seemed to follow his every word. But Senator Kennedy was different. Here was a man who'd made it to the highest levels of American government while never apologizing for where he came from or how he sounded. When Kennedy spoke on the Senate floor or appeared on news shows, Marcus felt a surge of pride that someone like him, someone who sounded like his grandfather, like his neighbors, like the people who'd raised him, could command respect on the national stage. Tonight, however, something felt different. Marcus noticed it in the way Victoria Sterling's lips curved into what might charitably be called a smile whenever Kennedy finished speaking, and in the barely suppressed chuckles from the other panelists. There was a predatory quality to the atmosphere that made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his second-hand recliner. The discussion had started innocuously enough, focusing on recent legislative developments in Congress. Kennedy had offered his perspective on a pending agriculture bill, speaking with the authority of someone who'd actually visited the farms and met the families who would be affected by the proposed changes. Well, I reckon the folks back home would tell you that government programs are a bit like fertilizer, Kennedy had said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that Marcus found so comforting. A little bit in the right places can help things grow, but too much of it and you'll kill everything in sight. The analogy was vintage Kennedy, homespun, accessible, and surprisingly sophisticated in its simplicity. But instead of engaging with the substance of his comment, Victoria Sterling seized on something else entirely. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that preceded a verbal ambush. "I have to ask, and I'm sure our viewers are wondering this too, do you ever consider how your distinctive speaking style might affect your ability to communicate with constituents outside of Louisiana?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Kennedy's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained pleasant, almost amused. "I'm not sure I follow, Miss Sterling." Sterling leaned forward, her smile growing sharper. "Well, you have this very regional way of speaking. Very colorful, very folksy. Some might say it's charming, but others might wonder if it's appropriate for someone representing American interests on the global stage." Dr. Rothschild and Amanda Chen exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but not enough to override their obvious anticipation of the show that was about to unfold. In his apartment, Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was exactly what he'd feared. The moment when someone with power and platform would voice what he suspected many people thought about voices like his. Kennedy's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. A sharpening of focus that suggested he understood exactly what game was being played. "Miss Sterling, I appreciate your concern for my constituents. They seem to understand me just fine, and I understand them. Sometimes that's all the communication a democracy needs." But Sterling wasn't finished. She turned to address the camera directly, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone delivering a lecture to particularly slow students. "I think what Senator Kennedy is getting at, and please, correct me if I'm translating this wrong, is that he believes his rural constituency appreciates his down-home approach to politics." The word "translating" landed like a slap. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as if he'd been the one insulted. On screen, Kennedy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing, waiting with the patience of someone who'd weathered many such storms. Sterling continued, emboldened by Kennedy's apparent passivity. "But I have to wonder, Senator, and I think our more sophisticated viewers might wonder too, whether this kind of, let's call it performance, doesn't sometimes get in the way of substantive policy discussion? When you're speaking to world leaders or addressing complex international issues, do you ever worry that your accent might be a barrier to being taken seriously?" The studio fell silent except for the low hum of equipment and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic 20 floors below. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something significant was happening, their lenses focusing with unusual intensity on Kennedy's face. In Louisiana, Marcus found himself leaning forward, his hands clenched into fists. This was the moment he'd been dreading since childhood, watching someone he respected be diminished and mocked for the simple crime of sounding like home. Kennedy adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness, a gesture that had become familiar to anyone who'd watched him navigate the treacherous waters of Washington politics. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the studio's sophisticated audio system. "Miss Sterling," he began, "that's a mighty interesting question. Mighty interesting indeed." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "You know, I've been thinking about language quite a bit lately, about how we talk, why we talk the way we do, and what it all means." Sterling's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the defensive reaction she'd expected. "See," Kennedy continued, his drawl somehow becoming more pronounced rather than less, "I grew up in a place where words matter, where the way you say something can be just as important as what you're saying. My mama, God rest her soul, used to tell me that our way of speaking wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of." The camera caught a subtle shift in the studio's atmosphere. Dr. Rothschild had stopped smiling, and Amanda Chen was watching Kennedy with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for defusing bombs. "You talk about sophisticated viewers," Kennedy said, his tone remaining conversational but gaining an undercurrent of steel. "Well, I've met sophisticated folks from all over this great country. And you know what I've learned? Intelligence doesn't have an accent. Wisdom doesn't sound like it comes from any particular zip code." Sterling tried to interrupt, but Kennedy continued with the unstoppable momentum of a river in flood. "My accent," he said, "carries the wisdom of generations. It carries the voices of farmers who've worked the same land for 100 years, of fishermen who've navigated bayous and gulf waters their whole lives, of teachers and preachers and small business owners who've built communities with their bare hands and their commitment to each other." The studio was transfixed now. Even the production staff behind the cameras had stopped their usual bustling to listen. "When I speak slowly," Kennedy continued, "it's not because I'm thinking slowly. It's because I'm thinking carefully. When I use what you might call colorful language, it's because I want people to understand not just what I'm saying, but what I mean." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes finding the camera. "You see, Miss Sterling, sophistication isn't about how you sound. It's about how you think, how you treat people, and whether you can solve problems that matter to real folks living real lives." Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected welling up in his eyes. This was exactly what he'd needed to hear, delivered with the kind of dignity and grace he'd hoped was possible, but had never quite believed he'd witness. Kennedy wasn't finished. "Now, you asked about communicating with world leaders. Well, I've sat across tables from presidents and prime ministers, from generals and diplomats, and you know what I've found? They don't care how I sound. They care about whether I understand the issues, whether I've done my homework, and whether I can find solutions that work for my people and theirs." Sterling's face had gone pale. What had started as a calculated humiliation was turning into something else entirely, a masterclass in dignity under fire. "In fact," Kennedy said, his voice warming with something that might have been amusement, "I remember sitting in a meeting with the German Chancellor last year. Complex trade discussion, lots of technical details. After we'd worked through some particularly thorny issues, she told me that she appreciated my authentic American perspective, said it was refreshing to talk to someone who didn't sound like every other politician she'd met." He paused, letting that sink in. Turns out, Miss Sterling, that authenticity translates pretty well in any language. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling looked like she was calculating whether to apologize or double down, while her fellow panelists seemed to have suddenly discovered the fascinating patterns in the studio's carpet. But Kennedy wasn't done delivering his lesson. "You know," he said, "there's something I've noticed about people who mock others for their accents or their way of speaking. It usually says more about the mocker than the mocked." His eyes found Sterling's, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a kindness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "Miss Sterling, I've been doing a little research on you. Nothing too fancy, just what any curious person might find in a few minutes online. Fascinating background you have. Born in Pittsburgh, grew up in a working-class neighborhood. Your father was a steel worker, your mother cleaned houses. You worked your way through community college before transferring to Vassar." Sterling's face went from pale to ashen. She clearly hadn't expected Kennedy to come armed with biographical information. "Now, I'm not bringing this up to embarrass you," Kennedy continued, his tone remaining gentle. "I'm bringing it up because it tells a story about the American dream. A young woman from a blue-collar family who worked hard, studied hard, and made something of herself. That's beautiful. That's admirable." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "But I am curious about something. In all those old interviews I watched, you did quite a few local news spots when you were starting out. You sounded a lot different than you do now. There was a little bit of Pittsburgh in your voice back then, a little bit of home." The camera captured Sterling's face perfectly, showing the exact moment when she realized where this was heading. "And I wonder," Kennedy said, when exactly you decided that the way your parents talked wasn't good enough for national television. When you decided that sounding like the people who raised you was somehow beneath the person you wanted to become. The silence stretched out like a held breath. In her earpiece, Sterling could hear her producer frantically trying to figure out how to salvage the segment, but she seemed frozen, unable to respond. Kennedy's voice, when he continued, was soft but clear. See, that's the real tragedy here. Not that someone might mock my accent, I've been dealing with that my whole life, and it rolls off me like water off a duck's back. The tragedy is when someone decides they have to abandon where they came from to get where they're going. He looked directly into the camera now, speaking not to Sterling or the other panelists, but to the millions of viewers watching at home. To all the young folks out there who might be watching, who might be thinking they need to change how they sound to be taken seriously, don't you believe it? Your voice is your heritage. Your accent is your identity. The way you speak carries the stories of everyone who came before you. In Lafayette, Marcus found himself nodding through his tears, feeling something shift inside his chest, a loosening of shame he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. And to anyone who thinks they can judge someone's intelligence or worth by their accent, Kennedy continued, well, you might want to think again. Some of the wisest people I've ever known spoke with thick regional dialects. Some of the most foolish people I've ever met spoke with perfect diction. He turned back to Sterling, his expression kind but firm. Miss Sterling, I don't hold your comments against you. We all make mistakes, and I suspect tonight might feel like one of those for you. But I do hope you'll think about something. The people who raised you, who sacrificed so you could sit in that chair, they deserved better than to be erased from your voice. The words hung in the air like a benediction and a challenge rolled into one. Sterling's eyes were bright with tears she was fighting not to shed. And when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Senator Kennedy, she said, I owe you an apology. And I owe my viewers an apology. What I did tonight was wrong. It was unprofessional, and it was cruel. Her voice cracked slightly. You're right about my background. You're right about what I lost along the way. I'm sorry. Kennedy's smile was warm and genuine. No need for apologies, Miss Sterling. We all find our way back home eventually. The rest of the show passed in a blur of subdued political discussion, but the damage and the healing had already been done. Within minutes of the show's end, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media like wildfire. #Accent Pride began trending, with thousands of Americans sharing stories about their own linguistic heritage and the shame they'd been made to feel about their voices. In Lafayette, Marcus picked up his phone and called his father for the first time in weeks. Dad, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I was just calling to tell you I love the way you sound. There was a pause on the other end, then his father's familiar voice, warm with the same accent Marcus had spent years trying to hide. Well, son, I love the way you sound too. Always have. The next morning, Victoria Sterling did something unprecedented in her career. She opened her show with a personal reflection on accent, identity, and the price of assimilation. Speaking in a voice that carried, for the first time in years, just a hint of Pittsburgh steel country, she talked about the journey from shame to pride, from hiding to authenticity. The segment went viral too, but this time for all the right reasons. Senator Kennedy, watching from his office in Washington, smiled and reached for his phone to call an old friend back home. Mama's boy, he said when the familiar voice answered, slipping easily into the comfortable rhythms of childhood. You'll never guess what happened to me on TV last night. The lesson was clear. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to be ashamed of who you are. Your voice, however it sounds, wherever it comes from, carries the story of your people. Don't let anyone convince you to erase that story. As Kennedy had said, sophistication isn't about how you sound. It's about how you think, how you treat people, and whether you can solve problems that matter. And sometimes, the most sophisticated thing you can do is speak with the voice that your grandparents would recognize as home. If this story of standing up for linguistic heritage and regional pride inspired you, consider supporting our channel. Your donations help us continue sharing these powerful tales of dignity, authenticity, and the courage to be yourself in a world that often demands conformity. Click the link below to contribute, and let's keep celebrating the beautiful diversity of American voices, one story at a time.